One of the most famous problems that religious people face who want to justify their belief in a god is the problem of evil. The problem of evil asks the question, why does evil and suffering exist in the world if an all-loving, all-powerful and all-knowing creator exists? If such a creator really did create the world, why is it not in his power to deliver us from the suffering and evil we experience and transform the world around us into a place with far less corruption and evil in it? In response to this question, theologians have come up with what are known as theodicies, or vindications of God. They try and give reasons why evil and suffering may exist in the world, while simultaneously believing in a God that is all-loving and all-powerful. They give reasons why, in a wholly good universe, a creator may still create a world where evil and suffering is present. In today's video, I'm going to list, in a tier ranking, some of the most popular theodicies from best to worst. The idea for this video was actually inspired by an atheist YouTuber called Genetically Modified Skeptic, who did a similar video on his channel where he ranked the arguments for God's existence in a tier list in a similar way. I thought it was a great video, and I'll leave a link to that in the description. Even though I don't agree with him on most theological or philosophical issues, I thought it'd be a fun idea to do something similar with theodicies. All I'm doing is ranking them on the merits of their philosophical rigor and how realistic they are in terms of providing a framework which we can view evil and suffering that makes sense as to why there could still be an all-loving creator and all-powerful creator who exists. So that being said, let's get into the tier list. So the first theodicy we're going to rank is the Augustinian theodicy. Saint Augustine of Hippo was a theologian from the 4th century. His theodicy states that God created the world perfectly. That is to say, there was nothing wrong with it. However, evil entered the world through humanity's original sin. Evil does not also really exist in the Augustinian theodicy, rather it's either a privation or corruption of good. It was our free will going against God's wishes and corrupting the perfection that he had given us that caused us to enter a fallen state, and that is as a result is our responsibility that evil and suffering exists in our own lives. So I'm going to put this one into C on the tier list, which may be surprising. It's one of the most well-known theodicies, but I think comparatively speaking it ranks up rather worse than a lot of the other ones on this list. So what are some of the pros and cons of the theodicy? Well, if you're a believer in the Christian God, then it does fit the Christian narrative very well, and it from a Christian perspective it gives a full explanation of why things really happen. With the original sin idea, you could see evil and suffering as punishment for our original sin, and this may seem unjust to a lot of people, but I think it's also important to realize that no human is free from sin, or at least that's one possible way of looking at it. I tend to believe that all humans go through life sinning. So the idea that there could be some form of self-inflicted justice that evil and suffering is brought onto us by our own self-inflicted actions, then I think that's a reasonable claim. It's also important to know what the potential of our lives would be if we were completely free from sin. You only have to look at examples of, say, Buddhist monks who set themselves on fire and didn't react and managed to sit still and meditate through it, to understand that perhaps if we really do still our souls enough and live without sin enough, then the limits of our lives and how we treat them is far beyond what we can imagine. That being said, what are some of the cons? Why have I put this argument as low down as C tier? Well, for a start, I don't think it really grapples with some of the brutality that people face, especially innocent people. It doesn't seem to always be the case that the way suffering is distributed through the world, it doesn't seem to be just to us a lot of the time. It's also strictly from a Christian perspective, so if there's any doubt over the claims of Christianity, then this weakens the argument if we're going to extract it on a more broad theological scale. Something else I don't understand is if suffering and evil is really just a privation of good, I find it difficult to see why the perfectly created creatures such as Adam and Eve would have such a flawed character to sin so easily. Yes, evil may be a corruption of good, but something still has to corrupt the good in the first place. Okay, so moving on to the next theodicy is the Irenaean theodicy. And we are going to put this one straight up into S tier, right at the top of all the list. The Irenaean theodicy states that humans are truly to be created in two parts, in the image and the likeness of God. Being created in the image of God means that when we were created, we had the possibility to achieve the moral perfection that God set out for us. Whereas when we are created in the likeness of God, it's when we finally reach a state where we can carry out such a moral perfection. God must be kept at an epistemic distance so that we can exert our free will and perfect ourselves on our own. Hick later developed this into the soul-making theodicy, which a lot of you may have heard about. It states that all possibility of evil and suffering exists so that our souls can be forged into greater souls. This is why we often become stronger from overcoming something, not just because we are more ready to do so in the future, but also because this suffering has imparted its mark on us. Our suffering can be our armor. While a life like this, where we have to overcome suffering repeatedly to achieve perfection, is undoubtedly more difficult than a life of paradise, Irenaeus would argue that it's a more noble form of life and gives us the option for a true moral perfection. For our triumph over evil to be on merit and achieved personally is the greatest thing that we can achieve. Hick believed in universal salvation, whereas Irenaeus did not. So what are some of the pros and cons of this theodicy? For a start, I would say that we can see real demonstrations of this being true in real life, where suffering is important to create something, a new good. For example, you don't want to have two overprotective parents because it weakens the character of the child, even if they may have everything they want, and that may keep them happy for a while. In the end, their character is going to be weakened. It also explains the existence of both evil and suffering, unlike some of the other arguments like the free will argument. And it shifts our focus onto the glory of triumph as something tangible, and that's quite inspiring. It states that every time there is some sort of bad in the world, or some sort of evil, there's the possibility to draw out of it a triumph or a victory that benefits the world in some way. It's important to note that triumph is an emotion that's positive to most people, but it's uniquely felt by those who have faced suffering and adversity, and strong suffering and adversity, and overcome it. What are the cons? Well, one would argue that it does little to explain why so much suffering is present. Why does some of the suffering have to be so brutal and so widespread, and why could there not just be a smaller dose of it? Why does it have to be the exact amount that there is? Which is a fair enough comment, although when I think this is combined with other theodicies, it becomes slightly less of an issue. Say, combining this theodicy with the free will theodicy states that, yes, evil and suffering is bad, and there's too much of it, but this is a result of some other good that we need, such as free will, being exploited and corrupted by evil individuals. Next up, we have the Plotinian theodicy, formulated by Plotinus, and we're going to put this one in B, slightly above the Augustinian theodicy. The Plotinian theodicy states that evil and suffering is really the lack of harmony between real things and their opposites. Evil is therefore non-being, or the lack of actualized potential of existing things. The soul aims for good, but when this aim is misplaced, it results in our existence in the physical world. Since we are finite, this element of non-being is a necessary part of our condition. Since God is infinite, all things that exist within him are brought into perfect harmony. However, with the lack of harmony we experience in our own lives, it's therefore down to us, needing to bring the right balance into our lives. This is one of the more complicated theodicies, and it states that our finitude is a necessary part of our existence, and the possibility for suffering therefore is also. But it moves the responsibility of our suffering onto us, and posits that if only we aimed correctly, then we would transform the world around us effortlessly. I would say this is an unreasonable claim, considering we don't know our full potential. And perhaps we could really bring the world into perfect harmony around us if we acted perfectly. And that would constitute some form of justice. So, an objection to the theodicy may be, well, wouldn't it be better just to have the world in a state of perfect harmony already? And the point of the theodicy states that there will always be some things that naturally don't want to fit in harmony with each other. But it's down to us, and as long as we act in the way that God wills us to, then we will bring harmony into our lives in the correct way. However, what this theodicy doesn't do is it doesn't explain why the brutality of some suffering and evil exists. It doesn't explain why things have to get so harsh and bloody in certain aspects of the world. Perhaps if we did aim correctly, we wouldn't suffer as much. But the theodicy seems to fail to distinguish between just suffering as punishment for ill aims and suffering that's inflicted upon innocent people. It doesn't seem fair that due to chance, an innocent person could be inflicted with so much more suffering than someone else. So that's why we've left the Plotinian theodicy in peace here for now. The next theodicy we'll talk about is the degree of desirability of consciousness theodicy. It's a bit of a complex and wordy name. It's a bit of a complicated theodicy, and we're putting that right in F tier. This is my least favourite theodicy of the bunch we're going through. The theodicy basically states that suffering is caused by a mental state being undesirable to us. And since it's not God's responsibility to make our mental state desirable to us, it's therefore our responsibility to escape our own suffering. And I put this in F tier because I think this theodicy has some major flaws. For a start, it seems to imply that it's our responsibility to find desirable or undesirable certain mental states. But this would include things like a loved one suffering in the real world. It seems to deny the existence of real problems for us to solve in the real world that existed be out of our control. It's not the case that if we see a problem in the real world, it's just up to us to make the conscious state desirable to ourselves. In fact, it should be undesirable to us. It's an indicator that something's wrong and that we need to fix something in the world. So I think this theodicy is rather just almost an attempt to flee from the reality of our condition. The other theodicies don't deny that the existence of suffering is tragic and a real problem, whereas this seems to not tackle the problem as deeply as the other ones, I don't think. So that's why it's gone down all the way in F tier. Next up, we're going to do the contrast theodicy, and this one's going to go up in A tier above the Plotinian and Augustinian theodicies. The contrast theodicy states that suffering and evil is necessary in order for us to understand what good is sufficiently. Without the existence of evil and suffering, we wouldn't know what good is enough to get the right amount of value out of it. And this may seem like a fairly unintuitive theodicy to some people at first, especially when you look around us and the existence of our suffering and evil hasn't sharpened the good in the world to stand out with enough clarity. It's not like the good is glistening out in our world as a result of the suffering and evil around us. However, I don't think this means that this will have to be the case in the future or for certain very moral individuals. The theodicy affirms suffering as something to be overcome rather than something merely tragic. It presents an opportunity for us to draw value out of our suffering. I think it's quite a realistic theodicy in a way, because it is the case that suffering can enhance our lives. Yes, it can also be incredibly detrimental to us and it can ruin us, which is all true. But the feeling of triumph is a feeling uniquely available to those who are facing adversity. We may also require enemies to live a fulfilling life. It's not clear that this wouldn't be the case. Dostoevsky famously wrote about how the first thing man would do in a material utopia where everything worked perfectly would to be cause mayhem just to have a problem to fix. There's also an idea in Christianity that mirrors this thought. Jesus on the cross famously cries out to God, asking why he has abandoned him. So here we have God incarnate in man. Yet when God is incarnated in man, there's a distance between him and the transcendent. So this implies that there is some form of divinity in having distance from God and the transcendent. The fact that the ideal is ever transcendent is very part of what it means to come to divinity. Which is a very interesting idea. It says that part of our striving is the best thing about us. Part of what we need to end up loving is the constant striving of our condition. That's why Jesus is willing to sacrifice himself for the whole world. He goes and draws out good from everywhere, and it's a constant. There's nothing that Jesus's love won't be outstretched and offered to. And I think that mirrors the idea that no matter how bad conditions can get, there's a way to struggle forwards. And this seems to mirror the ideas of the contrast theodicy for me. What are some of the cons? Why was this rated less than the Irenaean theodicy? Well, if we are to believe that evil remains a problem, we have to ask about how we should go about fighting evil and suffering in our world. If we try and eradicate it all, then have we got rid of the goodness of the contrast that God has intended for us? That's one thing to think about. It's also hard to see how all the suffering we experience is necessary, or again, that the way it is distributed is fully just. However, one only has to believe that the world has the potential to be redeemed for this not to be an issue. And finally, last but not least, we're going to do the Finite God theodicy. So this is going to go into D. It's my second least favourite of the bunch. It basically says that an all-loving creator can exist with suffering in the world. However, either he's not omnipotent or he's not omniscient. And well, one reason that I've put this one so low is because it doesn't get most people what they want out of theodicies. Theodicies for most people are an attempt to vindicate the idea that an all-knowing, all-powerful and all-loving creator exists. And it sort of redeems the idea of the best of all possible worlds idea. Redeems the idea that we may be living in the best of all possible worlds. However, I don't think this is the case with a finite God. It's a more evidential problem to why it may not be a true theodicy would be looking at the amount of evil and suffering around us. You may say that even if God is not omnipotent over his enemies, perhaps in a few cases there would be more moments of divine intervention that we could really see. With the other theodicies, God is more of a distant figure, and that is a good way of vindicating why so many of the bad things in the world that happen have to happen. But there's nothing in the Finite God theodicy that explicitly sets God at this epistemic distance from reality. So I would expect under that theodicy, on its own at least, to see more instances of divine justice and retribution against suffering and evil in the world. But they were just my thoughts. This was my tier listing of all the theodicies. There are a couple of others, but I thought I'd just include some of the main ones. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and let me know your favourite one as well. What did you think of this list? I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I've got another video coming out soon, which is going to be about the symbolism of the yin and yang and the hero myth, and I'm looking forward to that video a lot. So yeah, that should be good. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe, guys. I hope you all enjoyed, and have a good day. Goodbye.